System of joint cultivation. We have already indicated that in the earliest times the arable land was cultivated in common, probably by the several clans. Each clan tilled its own land, and thereafter distributed the produce among the several households belonging to it. There exists indeed an intimate connection between the system of joint tillage and the clan form of society, and even subsequently in Rome, joint residence and joint management were of frequent occurrence in the case of co-proprietors. Even the traditions of Roman law furnish the information that wealth consisted at first in cattle and the usufruct of the soil, and that it was not till later that land came to be distributed among the burgesses as their own special property. Better evidence that such was the case is afforded by the earliest designation of the wealth as cattle stock, or slave and cattle stock, and of the separate possessions of the children of the household and of slaves as small cattle, also by the earliest form of acquiring property through laying hold of it with the hand, which was only appropriate to the case of movable articles, and above all by the earliest measure of land of one's own, consisting of 2 jagera, which can only have applied to garden ground, and not to the hive. When and how the distribution of the arable land took place can no longer be ascertained. This much only is certain, that the oldest form of the Constitution was based not on freehold settlement, but on clanship as a substitute for it, whereas the Servian Constitution presupposes the distribution of the land. It is evident from the same Constitution that the great bulk of the landed property consisted of middle-sized farms, which provided work and subsistence for a family, and admitted of the keeping of cattle for tillage, as well as of the application of the plough. The ordinary extent of such a Roman full hide has not been ascertained with precision, but can scarcely, as has already been shown, be estimated at less than 20 jagera. Book 2, From the Abolition of the Monarchy in Rome to the Union of Italy. Chapter 8, Law, Religion, Military System, Economic Condition, Nationality. Farming of estates. In the national economy, agriculture was, and continued to be, the social and political basis both of the Roman community and of the new Italian state. The common assembly and the army consisted of Roman farmers. What as soldiers they had acquired by the sword, they secured as colonists by the plough. The insolvency of the middle class of landholders gave rise to the formidable internal crisis of the 3rd and 4th centuries, amidst which it seemed as if the young republic could not be destroyed. The revival of the Latin farmer class, which was produced during the 5th century partly by the large assignations of land and incorporations, partly by the fall in the rate of interest and the increase of the Roman population, was at once the effect and the cause of the mighty development of Roman power. The acute soldier's eye of Pyrrhus justly discerned the cause of the political and military ascendancy of the Romans in the flourishing condition of the Roman farms. But the rise also of husbandry on a large scale among the Romans appears to fall within this period. In earlier times, indeed, there existed landed estates of, at least comparatively, large size, but their management was not farming on a large scale. It was simply a husbandry of numerous small parcels. On the other hand, the enactment in the law of 387, not incompatible indeed with the earlier mode of management, but yet far more appropriate to the later, viz., that the landholder should be bound to employ, along with his slaves, a proportional number of free persons, may well be regarded as the oldest trace of the latter centralized farming of estates. And it deserves notice that even here, at its first emergence, it essentially rests on slaveholding. How it arose must remain an undecided point. Possibly the Carthaginian plantations in Sicily served as models to the oldest Roman landholders, and perhaps even the appearance of wheat in husbandry by the side of spelt, which Varro places about the period of the decemvirs, was connected with that altered style of management. It admits of no doubt that the restriction of this agricultural clientship very materially contributed towards the distress of the class of small cultivators. Building. Impulse given to it in respect to buildings the regal period, particularly the epoch of the great conquests, probably accomplished more than the first 2 centuries of the Republic. Structures like the temples on the Capitol and on the Aventine and the Great Circus were probably as obnoxious to the frugal fathers of the city as to the burgesses who gave their task work, and it is remarkable that perhaps the most considerable building of the Republican period before the Samnite Wars, the Temple of Ceres in the Circus, was a work of Spurius Cassius, who in more than one respect sought to lead the Commonwealth back to the traditions of the kings. The governing aristocracy, moreover, repressed private luxury with a rigor such as the rule of the kings, if prolonged, would certainly not have displayed. But at length even the Senate was no longer able to resist the superior force of circumstances. It was Appius Claudius who, in his epoch-making censorship, threw aside the antiquated rustic system of parsimonious hoarding and taught his fellow citizens to make a worthy use of the public resources. He began that noble system of public works of general utility, which justifies, if anything can justify, the military successes of Rome, even from the point of view of the welfare of the nations, and which even in its ruins furnishes some idea of the greatness of Rome to thousands on thousands who have never read a page of her history. To him the Roman state was indebted for its great military road, and the city of Rome for its first aqueduct. Following in the steps of Claudius, the Roman Senate wove around Italy that network of roads and fortresses, the formation of which has already been described, and without which, as the history of all military states from the Achaemenid down to the creator of the road of the Simplon shows no military hegemony can subsist. Following in the steps of Claudius, Manius Curius built from the proceeds of the Pyrrhic spoil a second aqueduct for the capital, and some years previously, with the gains of the Sabine War, he opened up for the Velino at the point where Terni, where it falls into the Nera, that broader channel in which the stream still flows, with a view to drain the beautiful valley of Rieti, and thereby to gain space for a large burgess settlement along with a modest farm for himself. Such works, in the eyes of persons of intelligence, threw into the shade the aimless magnificence of the Hellenic temples. Embellishment of the city. The style of living also among the citizens now was altered. About the time of Pyrrhus silver plate began to make its appearance on Roman tables, and the chroniclers date the disappearance of shingle roofs in Rome from 470. The new capital of Italy gradually laid aside its village-like aspect, and now began to embellish itself. It was not yet indeed customary to strip the temples in conquered towns of their ornaments for the decoration of Rome, but the beaks of the galleys of Antium were displayed at the orator's platform in the forum, and on public festival days the gold-mounted shields brought home the battlefields of Samnium were exhibited along the stalls of the market. The proceeds of fines were specially applied to the paving of the highways in and near the city, or at the erection and embellishment of public buildings. The wooden booths of the butchers, which stretched along the forum on both sides, gave way, first on the Palatine side, then on that also which faced the Carinae, to the stone stalls of the money changers, so that this place became the exchange of Rome. Statues of the famous men of the past, of the kings, priests, and heroes of the legendary period, and of the Grecian hero, Hospes, who was said to have interpreted to the decemvirs the laws of Solon, honorary columns and monuments dedicated to the great burgomasters who had conquered the Vietans, the Latins, and the Samnites, to state envoys who had perished while executing their instructions, to rich women who had bequeathed their property to public objects, nay, even to celebrated Greek philosophers and heroes such as Pythagoras and Alcibiades, were erected on the Capitol or in the Forum. Book 3. From the Union of Italy to the Subjugation of Carthage and the Greek States. Chapter 11. The Government and the Governed. Title hunting. But perhaps nothing so clearly evinces the decay of genuine pride and genuine honor in high and low alike as the hunting after insignia and titles, which appeared under different forms of expression, but with substantial identity of character among all ranks and classes. So urgent was the demand for the honor of a triumph that there was difficulty in upholding the old rule, which accorded a triumph only to the ordinary supreme magistrate who augmented the power of the commonwealth in open battle, and thereby, it is true, not unfrequently excluded from that honor the very authors of the most important successes. While formerly the commander-in-chief of the one year had reckoned it an honor to serve next year on the staff of his successor, the fact that the consular, Cato, took service as a military tribune under Tiberius Sempronius Longus and Manius Labrio, was now regarded as a demonstration against the new-fashioned arrogance. Formerly, the thanks of the community once for all had sufficed for service rendered to the state. Now every meritorious act seemed to demand a permanent distinction. Already, Gaius Duilius, the victor of Mylae, had gained an exceptional permission that, when he walked in the evening through the streets of the capital, he should be preceded by a torchbearer and a piper. Statues and monuments, very often erected at the expense of the person whom they purported to honor, became so common that it was ironically pronounced a distinction to have none. But such merely personal honors did not long suffice. A custom came into vogue by which the victor and his descendants derived a permanent surname from the victories they had won. A custom mainly established by the victor of Zama, who got himself designated as the hero of Africa, his brother as the hero of Asia, and his cousin as the hero of Spain. The example set by the higher was followed by the humbler classes. When the ruling order did not disdain to settle the funeral arrangements for different ranks, and to decree to the man who had been censor a purple winding sheet, it could not complain of the freedmen for desiring that their sons, at any rate, might be decorated with the much envied purple border. The robe, the ring, and the amulet case distinguished not only the burgess and the burgess wife from the foreigner and the slave, but also the person who was freeborn from the one who had been a slave, the son of a freeborn from the son of a manumitted parents, the son of the knight, and the senator from the common burgess. The descendant of a curule house from the common senator, and this in a community where all that was good and great was the work of civil equality. The dissension in the community was reflected in the ranks of the opposition. Resting on the support of the farmers, the patriots raised a loud cry for reform. Resting on the support of the mob in the capital, demagogism began its work. Although the two tendencies do not admit of being wholly separated, but in various respects go hand in hand, it will be necessary to consider them apart. The Party of Reform Cato. The Party of Reform emerges, as it were, personified in Marcus Porcius Cato. Cato, the last statesman of note belonging to that earlier system which restricted its ideas to Italy and was averse to universal empire, was for that reason accounted in after times the model of a genuine Roman of the antique stamp. He may with greater justice be regarded as the representative of the opposition of the Roman middle class to the new Hellenico-cosmopolite nobility. Brought up at the plough, he was induced to enter on political career by the owner of a neighboring estate, one of the few nobles who kept aloof from the tendencies of the age, Lucius Valerius Flaccus. That upright patrician deemed the rough Sabine farmer the proper man to stem the current of the times, and he was not deceived in his estimate. Beneath the aegis of Flaccus, and after the good old-fashioned serving his fellow citizens and the commonwealth in counsel and action, Cato fought his way up to the consulate and a triumph, and even to the censorship. He took up the keynote first struck by Manius Curius. His ideal among Roman statesmen, throughout his long life he made it his task honestly, to the best of his judgment, to assail on all hands the prevailing declension, and even in his 85th year he battled in the forum with the new spirit of the times. He was anything but comely. He had green eyes, his enemies alleged, and red hair, and he was not a great man. still less a far-seeing statesman. Though thoroughly narrow in his political and moral views, and having the idea of the good old times always before his eyes and on his lips, he cherished an obstinate contempt for everything new, deeming himself, by virtue of his own austere life, entitled to manifest an unrelenting severity and harshness towards everything and everybody upright and honorable, but without a glimpse of any duty lying beyond the sphere of police order and of mercantile integrity, an enemy to all villainy and vulgarity, as well as to all refinement and geniality, and above all things the foe of his foes. He never made an attempt to stop evils at their source, but waged war throughout life against symptoms, and especially against persons. The ruling lords, no doubt, looked down with a lofty disdain on the ignoble growler, and believed, not without reason, that they were far superior, but fashionable corruption in and out of the Senate secretly trembled in the presence of the old censor of morals with his proud republican bearing, of the scar-covered veteran from the Hannibalic War, and of the highly influential senator and the idol of the Roman farmers. Demagogism. But as this period witnessed the rise of a rabble by the side of Burgess, so it witnessed also the emergence of a demagogism that flattered the populace alongside of the respectable and useful party of opposition. Cato was already acquainted with men who made a trade of demagogism, who had a morbid propensity for speechifying, as others had for drinking or for sleeping, who hired listeners if they could find no willing audience otherwise, and whom people heard as they heard the market crier, without listening to their words, or in the event of needing help, entrusting themselves to their hands. In his caustic fashion the old man describes these fops formed after the model of the Greek talkers of the Agora, dealing in jests and witticisms, singing and dancing, ready for anything. Such an one was, in his opinion, good for nothing, but to exhibit himself as harlequin in a procession, and to bandy talk with the public. He would sell his talk or his silence for a bit of bread. In reality, these demagogues were the worst enemies of reform. While the reformers insisted above all things and in every direction on moral amendment, demagogism preferred to insist on the limitation of the powers of the government and the extension of those of the burgesses. Chapter 12. The Management of Land and of Capital Slaves. The human labor on the farm was regularly performed by slaves. At the head of the body of slaves on the estate stood the steward, who received and expended, bought and sold, went to obtain the instructions of the landlord, and in his absence issued orders and administered punishment. Under him were placed the stewardesses. Under him were placed the stewardess, who took charge of the house, kitchen, and larder, poultry yard, and dovecot, a number of ploughmen and common serfs, an ass-driver, a swineherd, and where a flock of sheep was kept, a shepherd. The number, of course, varied according to the method of husbandry pursued. The steward, of course, occupied a freer position than the other slaves. The treatise of Mago advised that he should be allowed to marry, to rear children, and to have funds of his own, and Cato advises that he should be married to the stewardess. He alone had some prospect, in the event of good behavior, of obtaining liberty from his master. In other respects, all formed of common household. The slaves were, like the larger cattle, not bred on the estate, but purchased at an age capable of labor in the slave market. And when through age or infirmity they had become incapable of working, they were again sent with other refuse to the market. It was not the ordinary practice to place chains on the slaves, but when anyone had incurred punishment or was thought likely to attempt an escape, he was set to work in chains and was shut up during the night in the slaves' prison. Competition of transmarine corn. In order to form some estimate of the economic results of this system of husbandry, we must consider the state of prices, and particularly the prices of grain at this period. On an average, these were alarmingly low, and that in great measure through the fault of the Roman government, which in this important question was led into the most fearful blunders, not so much by its short-sightedness, as by an unpardonable disposition to favor the proletariat of the capital at the expense of the farmers of Italy. The main question here was that of the competition between transmarine and Italian corn. The grain which was delivered by the provincials to the Roman government, sometimes gratuitously, sometimes for a moderate compensation, was in part applied by the government to the maintenance of the Roman official staff and of the Roman armies on the spot, partly given up to the leases of the dacumae on condition of their either paying a sum of money for it or of their undertaking to deliver certain quantities of grain to Rome, at Rome, or wherever else it should be acquired. From the time of the Second Macedonian War, the Roman armies were uniformly supported by transmarine corn, and though this tended to the benefit of the Roman exchequer, it cut off the Italian farmer from an important field of consumption for his produce. This, however, was the least part of the mischief. The government had long, as was reasonable, kept a watchful eye on the price of grain, and when there was a threatening of dearth, had interfered by well-timed purchases abroad. And now, when the corn deliveries of its subjects brought into its hands every year large quantities of grain, larger probably than were needed in times of peace, and when, moreover, opportunities were presented to it of acquiring foreign grain in almost unlimited quantity at moderate prices, there was a natural temptation to glut the markets of the capital with such grain, and to dispose of it at rates which earlier in themselves, or as compared with Italian rates, were ruinously low. Already in the years 551, 554, and in the first instance apparently at the suggestion of Scipio, 6 modii of Spanish and African wheat were sold on public account to the citizens of Rome at 24, and even at 12 asses. Some years afterwards, more than 240,000 bushels of Sicilian grain were distributed at the latter illusory price in the capital. In vain, Cato inveighed against this short-sighted policy. The rise of demagogism had a part in it, and these extraordinary but presumably very frequent distributions of grain under the market price by the government or individual magistrates became the germs of the subsequent corn laws. But even when the transmarine corn did not reach the consumers in this extraordinary mode, it injuriously affected Italian agriculture. Not only were the masses of grain which the state sold off to the leases of the tenths beyond doubt acquired under ordinary circumstances by these so cheaply that, when resold, they could be disposed of under the price of production, but it is probable that in the provinces, particularly in Sicily, in consequence partly of the favorable nature of the soil, partly of the extent to which wholesale farming and slaveholding were pursued on the Carthaginian system, the price of production was in general considerably lower than in Italy, while the transport of Sicilian and Sardinian corn to Latium was at least as cheap as, if not cheaper than, its transport thither from Etruria, Campania, or even northern Italy. In the natural course of things, before transmarine corn could not but flow to the peninsula and lower the price of the grain produced there, under the unnatural disturbance of relations occasioned by the lamentable system of slave labor, it would perhaps have been justifiable to impose a duty on transmarine corn for the protection of the Italian farmer. But the very opposite course seems to have been pursued, and with a view to favor the import of the transmarine corn to Italy, a prohibitive system seems to have been applied in the provinces. For though the Rhodanians were allowed to export a quantity of corn from Sicily by way of special favor, the export of grain from the provinces must probably, as a rule, have been free only as regarded Italy, and the transmarine corn must thus have been monopolized for the benefit of the mother country. Revolution in Roman agriculture. In a great industrial state, whose agriculture cannot feed its population, such a result might perhaps be regarded as useful, or at any rate as not absolutely injurious. But a country like Italy, where manufactures were inconsiderable and agriculture was altogether the mainstay of the state, was in this way systematically ruined, and the welfare of the nation as a whole was sacrificed in the most shameful fashion to the interests of the essentially unproductive population of the capital, to which in fact bread could never become too cheap. Nothing perhaps evinces so clearly as this how wretched was the constitution and how incapable was the administration of this so-called golden age of the Republic. Any representative system, however meager, would have led at least to serious complaints and to a perception of the seat of the evil. But in those primary assemblies of the burgesses, anything was listened to sooner than the warning advice of a foreboding patriot. Any government that deserved the name would of itself have interfered, but the mass of the Roman Senate, probably with well-meaning credulity, regarding the low prices of grain as a real blessing for the people, and the Scipios and Flamininus had forsooth more important things to do, to emancipate the Greeks, and to exercise the functions of republican kings. Chapter 14. Literature and Art. Medicine. Physics and mathematics were not much studied in Rome, but the applied sciences connected with them received a certain measure of attention. This was most of all true of medicine. In 535, the first Greek physician, the Peloponnesian Archagathus, settled in Rome, and there acquired such repute by his surgical operations that a residence was assigned to him on the part of the state, and he received the freedom of the city, and thereafter his colleagues flocked in crowds to Italy. Cato, no doubt, not only reviled the foreign medical practitioners with a zeal worthy of a better cause, but attempted, by means of his medical manual compiled from his own experience, and probably in part also from the medical literature of the Greeks, to revive the good old fashion under which the father of the family was at the same time the family physician. The physicians and the public gave themselves, as was reasonable, but little concern about his obstinate invectives. At any rate, the profession, one of the most lucrative which existed in Rome, continued a monopoly in the hands of the foreigners, and for centuries there were none but Greek physicians in Rome. Architecture. Let us glance in conclusion at the state of the arts of architecture, sculpture, and painting. So far as concerns the former, the traces of incipient luxury were less observable in public than in private buildings. It was not till towards the close of this period, and especially from the time of the censorship of Cato, that the Romans began in the case of the former to have respect to the conveniences as well as to the bare wants of the public, to line with stone on the basins supplied from the aqueducts, to erect colonnades, and above all to transfer to Rome the Attic halls for courts and business. The first of these buildings, somewhat corresponding to our modern bazaars, the Porcian or Silversmiths Hall, was erected by Cato in 570 alongside of the Senate House. Others were soon associated with it, till gradually along the sides of the Forum the private shops were replaced by these splendid columnar halls. Everyday life, however, was more deeply influenced by the revolution in domestic architecture, which must, at latest, be placed in this period. The hall of the house, court, garden, and garden colonnade, the record chamber, chapel, kitchen, and bedrooms were by degrees severally provided for. And as to the internal fittings, the column began to be applied both in the court and in the hall for the support of the open roof, and also for the garden colonnades. Throughout these arrangements, it is probable that Greek models were copied, or at any rate made use of. Yet the materials used in building remained simple. Our ancestors, says Varro, dwelt in houses of brick, and laid merely a moderate foundation of stone to keep away damp. Plastic art and painting. Of Roman plastic art we scarcely encounter any other trace than perhaps the embossing in wax of the images of ancestors. Painters and painting are mentioned somewhat more frequently. Manius Valerius caused the victory which he obtained over the Carthaginians and Hiero in 491 off Messina to be depicted on the side wall of the Senate House. The first historical frescoes in Rome, which were followed by many of similar character, and which were in the domain of the arts of design, what the natural epos and the national drama became not much later in the domain of poetry. We find named as painters one Theodotus. We find named as painters one Theodotus, who, as Navius scoffingly said, sedens in cella circumtectus tegetibus laris ludentis penixit bubulo. Marcus Pacuvius of Brundisium, who painted in the temple of Hercules in the Forum Boreum, the same who, when more advanced in life, made himself a name as an editor of Greek tragedies, and Marcus Platius Lyco, a native of Asia Minor, whose beautiful paintings in the temple of Juno at Ardea procured for him the freedom of that city. But these very facts clearly indicate not only that the exercise of art in Rome was altogether of subordinate importance and more of a manual occupation than an art, but also that it fell, probably still more exclusively than poetry, into the hands of Greeks and half-Greeks. On the other hand, there appeared in genteel circles the first traces of the tastes subsequently displayed by the dilettante and the collector. Book 4, The Revolution, Chapter 13, Literature and Art. Stilo. The Roman who established the investigation of the Latin language and antiquities in the spirit of the Alexandrian masters on a scientific basis was Lucius Aelius Stilo. Lucius Aelius Stilo, about 650. He first went back to the oldest monuments of the language and commented on the Salian litanies and the 12 tables. He devoted his special attention to the comedy of the 6th century and first formed a list of the pieces of Plautus which in his opinion were genuine. He sought after the Greek fashion to determine historically the origin of every single phenomenon in the Roman life and dealings, and to ascertain in each case the inventor, and at the same time brought the whole analytic tradition within the range of his research. The success which he had among his contemporaries is attested by the dedication to him of the most important poetical and the most important historical work of his time, the satires of Lucilius, and the Annals of Antipater. And this first Roman philologist influenced the studies of his nation for the future by transmitting his spirit of investigation both into words and into things to his disciple Varro. Book 5, The Establishment of the Military Monarchy. Chapter 12, Religion, Culture, Literature, and Art. Alexandrinism. In comparison with the previous epoch, the Greek as well as the Latin training improved in extent and in scholastic strictness quite as much as it declined in purity and in refinement. The increasing eagerness after Greek lore gave to instruction of itself an erudite character. To explain Homer or Euripides was after all no art. Teachers and scholars found their account better in handling the Alexandrian poems, which, besides, were in their spirit far more congenial to the Roman world of that day than the genuine Greek national poetry, and which, if they were not quite so venerable as the Iliad, possessed at any rate an age sufficiently respectable to pass as classics with schoolmasters. The love poems of Euphorion, the causes of the causes of Callimachus and his Ibis, the comically obscure Alexandra of Lycophron, contained in rich abundance rare vocables suitable for being extracted and interpreted, sentences laboriously involved and difficult of analysis, prolix digressions full of mystic combinations of antiquated myths, and generally a store of cumbersome erudition of all sorts. Instruction needed exercises more and more difficult. These productions, in great part model efforts of schoolmasters, were excellently adapted to be lessons for model scholars. Thus, the Alexandrian poems took a permanent place in Italian scholastic instruction, especially as trial themes, and certainly promoted knowledge, although at the expense of taste and of discretion. The same unhealthy appetite for culture, moreover, impelled the Roman youths to derive their Hellenism as much as possible from the fountainhead. The courses of the Greek masters in Rome sufficed only for a first start. Everyone who wished to be able to converse heard lectures on Greek philosophy at Athens, and on Greek rhetoric at Rhodes, and made a literary and artistic tour through Asia Minor, where most of the old art treasures of the Hellenists were still to be found on the spot. And the cultivation of the fine arts had been continued, although after a mechanical fashion, whereas Alexandria, more distant and more celebrated as the seat of the exact sciences, was far more rarely the point whither young men desirous of culture directed their travels. Architecture. If, in fine, we cast a glance at art, we discover here the same unpleasing phenomena which pervade the whole mental life of this period. Building on part of the state was virtually brought to a total stand amidst the scarcity of money that marked the last age of the Republic. We have already spoken of the luxury in building of the Roman grandees. The architects learned in consequence of this to be lavish of marble. The colored sorts, such as the yellow Numidian and other, came into vogue at this time, and the marble quarries of Luna were now employed for the first time, and began to inlay the floors of the rooms with mosaic work, to panel the walls with slabs of marble, or to paint the compartments in imitation of marble. The first steps towards the subsequent fresco painting, but art was not a gainer by this lavish magnificence. Arts of design. In the arts of design, connoisseurship and collecting were always on the increase. Ancient works of art were formerly hunted after, statues and pictures less, it is true, then, in accordance with the rude character of Roman luxury, artistically wrought furniture and ornaments of all sorts for the room and the table. As early as that age, the old Greek tombs of Capua and Corinth were ransacked for the sake of the bronze and earthenware vessels which had been placed in the tomb along with the dead. For a small statuette of bronze, 40,000 sesterces were paid, and 200,000 for a pair of costly carpets. A well-wrought bronze cooking machine came to cost more than an estate. In this barbaric hunting after the art, the rich amateur was, as might be expected, frequently cheated by those who supplied him. But the economic ruin of Asia Minor, in particular, so exceedingly rich in artistic products, brought many really ancient and rare ornaments and works of art into the market. And from Athens, Syracuse, Cyzicus, Pergamus, Chios, Samos, and other ancient seats of art, everything that was for sale, and very much that was not migrated to the palaces and villas of the Roman grandees. We have already mentioned what treasures of art were to be found within the house of Lucullus, who indeed was accused, perhaps not unjustly, of having gratified his interest in the fine arts at the expense of his duties as a general. The amateurs of art crowded thither as they crowd at present to the Villa Borghese, and complained even then of such treasures being confined to the palaces and country houses of the men of quality, where they could be seen only with difficulty and after special permission from the possessor. The public buildings, on the other hand, were far from filled in like proportion with famous works of Greek masters, and in many cases there still stood in the temples of the capital nothing but the old images of the gods carved in wood. As to the exercise of art, there is virtually nothing to report. There is hardly mentioned by name from this period any Roman sculptor or painter except a certain Aurelius, whose pictures rapidly went off, not on account of their artistic value, but because the cunning reprobate furnished in his pictures of the goddesses faithful portraits of his mistresses for the time being. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, complete 6 volumes, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 10. Emperors Decius, Gallus, Aemilianus, Valerian, and Gallienus. Part 2. The Goths were now in possession of the Ukraine, a country of considerable extent and uncommon fertility, intersected with navigable rivers, which, from either side, discharged themselves into the Borysthenes, and interspersed with large and lofty forests of oaks. The plenty of game and fish, the innumerable beehives deposited in the hollow of old trees, and in the cavities of rocks, and forming, even in that rude age, a valuable branch of commerce, the size of the cattle, the temperature of the air, the aptness of the soil for every species of grain, and the luxuriancy of the vegetation, all displayed the liberality of nature, and tempted the industry of man. But the Goths withstood all these temptations, and still adhered to a life of idleness, of poverty, and of rapine. The Scythian hordes, which, towards the east, bordered on the new settlements of the Goths, presented nothing to their arms, except the doubtful chance of an unprofitable victory. But the prospect of the Roman territories were far more alluring. and the fields of Dacia were covered with rich harvests, sown by the hands of an industrious and exposed to be gathered by those of a warlike people. It is probable that the conquests of Trajan, maintained by his successors, less for any real advantage than for ideal dignity, had contributed to weaken the empire on that side. The new and unsettled province of Dacia was neither strong enough to resist, nor rich enough to satiate the rapaciousness of the barbarians. As long as the remote banks of the Dniester were considered as the boundary of the Roman power, the fortifications of the lower Danube were more carelessly guarded, and the inhabitants of the Masia lived in supine security, fondly conceiving themselves at an inaccessible distance from any barbarian invaders. The eruptions of the Goths under the reign of Philip fatally convinced them of their mistake. The king, or leader, of that fierce nation traversed with contempt the province of Dacia, and passed both the Dniester and the Danube without encountering any opposition capable of retarding his progress. The relaxed discipline of the Roman troops betrayed the most important posts, where they were stationed, and the fear of deserved punishment induced great numbers of them to enlist under the Gothic standard. The various multitude of barbarians appeared at length under the walls of Marcianopolis, a city built by Trajan in honor of his sister, and at that time the capital of the second Masia. The inhabitants consented to ransom their lives and property by the payment of a large sum of money, and the invaders retreated back into their deserts, animated rather than satisfied with the first success of their arms against an opulent but feeble country. Intelligence was soon transmitted to the Emperor Decius that Sneva, king of the Goths, had possessed the Danube a second time, with more considerable forces, that his numerous detachments scattered devastation over the province of Masia, whilst the main body of the army, consisting of 70,000 Germans and Sarmatians, a force equal to the most daring achievements, required the presence of the Roman monarch, and the exertion of his military power. At the same time, when Decius was struggling with the violence of the tempest, his mind, calm and deliberate amidst the tumult of war, investigated the more general causes that, since the age of the Antonines, had so impetuously urged the decline of the Roman greatness. He soon discovered that it was impossible to replace that greatness on a permanent basis without restoring public virtue, ancient principles and manners, and the oppressed majesty of the laws. To execute this noble but arduous design, he first resolved to revive the obsolete officer of censor, an office which, as long as it had subsisted in its pristine integrity, had so much contributed to the perpetuity of the state, till it was usurped and gradually neglected by the Caesars. Conscious that the favor of the sovereign may confer power, but that the esteem of the people can alone bestow authority, he submitted the choice of the censor to the unbiased voice of the Senate. By their unanimous votes, or rather acclamations, Valerian, who was afterwards emperor, and who then served with distinction in the army of Decius, was declared the most worthy of that exalted honor. By their unanimous votes, or rather acclamations, Valerian, who was afterwards emperor, and who then served with distinction in the army of Decius, was declared the most worthy of that exalted honor. As soon as the decree of the Senate was transmitted to the emperor, he assembled a great council in his camp, and before the investiture of the censor-elect, he apprised him of the difficulty and importance of his great office. "Happy Valerian," said the prince to his distinguished subject, "happy in the general approbation of the Senate and of the Roman Republic. Accept the censorship of mankind and judge of our manners. You will select those who deserve to continue members of the Senate. You will restore the equestrian order to its ancient splendor. You will improve the revenue, yet moderate the public burdens. You will distinguish into regular classes the various and infinite multitude of citizens, and accurately view the military strength, the wealth, the virtue, and the resources of Rome. Your decisions shall obtain the force of laws. The army, the palace, the ministers of justice, and the great officers of the empire are all subject to your tribunal. None are exempted, excepting only the ordinary consuls. The prefect of the city, the king of the sacrifices, and as long as she preserves her chastity inviolate, the eldest of the Vestal virgins. Even these few, who may not dread the severity, will anxiously solicit the esteem of the Roman censor. A magistrate invested with such extensive powers would have appeared not so much the minister as the colleague of his sovereign. Valerian justly dreaded an elevation so full of envy and of suspicion. He modestly argued the alarming greatness of the trust, his own insufficiency, and the incurable corruption of the times. He artfully insinuated that the office of censor was inseparable from the imperial dignity, and that the feeble hands of a subject were unequal to the support of such an immense weight of cares and of power. The approaching event of war soon put an end to the prosecution of a project so specious. But so impracticable, and whilst it preserved Valerian from the danger, saved the Emperor Decius from the disappointment which would most probably have attended it. A censor may maintain he can never restore the morals of a state. It is impossible for such a magistrate to exert his authority with benefit or even with effect, unless he is supported by a quick sense of honor and virtue in the minds of the people, by a decent reverence for the public opinion, and by a train of useful prejudices combating on the side of national manners. In a period when these principles are annihilated, the censorial jurisdiction must either sink into empty pageantry or be converted into a partial instrument of vexatious oppression. It was easier to vanquish the Goths than to eradicate the public vices. Yet even in the first of these enterprises, Decius lost his army and his life. But the Romans were irritated to a still higher degree when they discovered that they had not even secured their repose, though at the expense of their honor. the dangerous secret of the wealth and weakness of the empire had been revealed to the world. New swarms of barbarians, encouraged by the success and not conceiving themselves bound by the obligation of their brethren, spread devastation through the Ilian provinces, and terror as far as the gates of Rome. The murder of Gallus and of his son Volusianus put an end to the civil war, and the Senate gave a legal sanction to the rights of conquest. The letters of Aemilianus to that assembly displayed a mixture of moderation and vanity. He assured them that he should resign to their wisdom the civil administration, and contenting himself with the quality of their general, would in a short time assert the glory of Rome, and deliver the empire from all the barbarians both of the north and of the east. His pride was flattered by the applause of the Senate, and medals are still extant representing him with the name and attributes of Hercules the victor and Mars the avenger. If the new monarch possessed the abilities, he wanted the time necessary to fulfill these splendid promises. Less than 4 months intervened between his victory and his fall. He had vanquished Gallus. He sunk under the weight of a competitor more formidable than Gallus. That unfortunate prince had sent Valerian, already distinguished by the honorable title of censor, to bring the legions of Gaul and Germany to his aid. Valerian executed that commission with zeal and fidelity, and as he arrived too late to save his sovereign, he resolved to revenge him. The troops of Aemilianus, who still lay encamped in the plains of Spoleto, were awed by the sanctity of his character, but much more by the superior strength of his army. And as they were now become as incapable of personal attachment as they had always been of constitutional principle, they readily imbrued their hands in the blood of a prince who so lately had been the object of their partial choice. The guilt was theirs, but the advantage of it was Valerian's, who obtained the possession of the throne by the means indeed of a civil war, but with a degree of innocence singular in that age of revolutions, since he owed neither gratitude nor allegiance to his predecessor, whom he dethroned. Valerian was about 60 years of age when he was invested with the purple, not by the caprice of the populace or the clamors of the army, but by the unanimous voice of the Roman world. In his gradual ascent through the honors of the state, he had deserved the favor of virtuous princes, and had declared himself the enemy of tyrants. His noble birth, but his mild but unblemished manners, his learning, prudence, and experience were revered by the Senate and people. And if mankind had been left at liberty to choose a master, their choice would most assuredly have fallen on Valerian. Perhaps the merit of this emperor was inadequate to his reputation. Perhaps his abilities, or at least his spirit, were affected by the languor and coldness of old age. The consciousness of his decline engaged him to share the throne with a younger and more active associate. The emergency of the times demanded a general no less than a prince, and the experience of the Roman censor might have directed him where to bestow the imperial purple as the reward of military merit. But instead of making a judicious choice, which would have confirmed his reign and endured his memory, Valerian, consulting only the dictates of affection or vanity, immediately invested with supreme honors his son Galenus, a youth whose effeminate vices had been hitherto concealed by the obscurity of a private station. The joint government of the father and the son subsisted about 7, and the sole administration of Galenus continued about 8 years. But the whole period was one uninterrupted series of confusion and calamity. As the Roman Empire was at the same time and on every side attacked by the blind fury of foreign invaders and the wild ambition of domestic usurpers. Chapter 10. Emperors Decius, Gallus, Aemilianus, Valerian, and Galenus. Part 4. The new sovereign of Persia, Artaxerxes, and his son Sapor had triumphed over the house of Arsaces. Of the many princes of that ancient race, Khosroes, king of Armenia, had alone preserved both his life and his independence. He defended himself by the natural strength of his country, by the perpetual resort of fugitives and malcontents, by the alliance of the Romans, and above all, by his own courage. Invincible in arms during a 30 years' war, he was at length assassinated by the emissaries of Sapor, king of Persia. The patriotic satraps of Armenia, who asserted the freedom and dignity of the crown, implored the protection of Rome in favor of Tiridates, the lawful heir. But the son of Khosroes was an infant, the allies were at a distance, and the Persian monarch advanced towards the frontier at the head of an irresistible force. Young Tiridates, the future of hope of his country, was saved by the fidelity of a servant, and Armenia continued above 27 years as a reluctant province of the great monarchy of Persia. Elated with this easy conquest, and presuming on the distresses or the degeneracy of the Romans, Sapor obliged the strong garrisons of Carrhae and Nisibis to surrender, and spread devastation and terror on either side of the Euphrates. The loss of an important frontier, the ruin of a faithful and natural ally, and the rapid success of Sapor's ambition affected Rome with a deep sense of the insult as well of the danger. Valerian flattered himself that the vigilance of his lieutenants would sufficiently provide for the safety of the Rhine and of the Danube, but he resolved, notwithstanding his advanced age, to march in person to the defense of the Euphrates. During his progress through Asia Minor, the naval enterprises of the Goths were suspended, and the afflicted province enjoyed a transient and fallacious calm. He passed the Euphrates, encountered the Persian monarch near the walls of Edessa, was vanquished and taken prisoner by Sapor. The particulars of this great event are darkly and imperfectly represented, yet, by the glimmering light which is afforded us, we may discover a long series of imprudence, of error, and of deserved misfortunes on the side of the Roman emperor. He reposed an implicit confidence in Macrianus, his praetorian prefect. That worthless minister rendered his master formidable only to the oppressed subjects, and contemptible to the enemies of Rome. By his weak or wicked counsels, the imperial army was betrayed into a situation where valor and military skill were equally unavailing. The vigorous attempt of the Romans to cut their way through the Persian host was repulsed with great slaughter, and Sapor, who encompassed the camp with superior numbers, patiently waited till the increasing rage of famine and pestilence had ensured his victory. The licentious murmurs of the legions soon accused Valerian as the cause of their calamities. Their seditious clamors demanded an instant capitulation. An immense sum of gold was offered to purchase the permission of a disgraceful retreat. But the Persian, conscious of his superiority, refused the money with disdain, and detaining the deputies, advanced in order of battle to the foot of the Roman rampart, and insisted on a personal conference with the emperor. Valerian was reduced to the necessity of entrusting his life and dignity to the faith of an enemy. The interview ended as it was natural to expect. The emperor was made a prisoner, and his astonished troops laid down their arms. In such a moment of triumph, the pride and policy of Sapor prompted him to fill the vacant throne with a successor entirely dependent on his pleasure, Cyriades. Cyriades, an obscure fugitive of Antioch, stained with every vice, was chosen to dishonor the Roman purple, and the will of the Persian victor could not fail of being ratified by the acclamations, however reluctant, of the captive army. He despaired of making any permanent establishment in the empire, and sought only to leave behind him a wasted desert, whilst he transported into Persia the people and the treasures of the provinces. At the time when the East trembled at the name of Sapor, he received a present not unworthy of the greatest kings, a long train of camels laden with the most rare and valuable merchandises. The rich offering was accompanied with an epistle, respectful but not servile, from Odenathus, one of the noblest and most opulent senators of Palmyra. Who is this Odenathus, that he thus insolently presumes to write to his lord? If he entertains a hope of mitigating his punishment, let him fall prostrate before the foot of our throne, with his hands bound behind his back. Should he hesitate, swift destruction shall be poured on his head, on his whole race, and on his country. The desperate extremity to which the Palmyrenian was reduced called into action all the latent powers of his soul. He met Sapor, but he met him in arms, infusing his own spirit into a little army collected from the villages of Syria and the tents of the desert. He hovered around the Persian host, harassed their retreat, carried off part of their treasure, and, what was dearer than any treasure, several of the women of the great king, who was at last obliged to repass the Euphrates with some marks of haste and confusion. By this exploit, Odenathus laid the foundations of his future fame and fortunes. The majesty of Rome, oppressed by a Persian, was protected by a Syrian, or Arab, of Palmyra. The Emperor Galenus, who had long supported with impatience the censorial severity of his father and colleague, received the intelligence of his misfortunes with secret pleasure and avowed indifference. "I knew that my father was a mortal," said he, "and since he has acted as it becomes a brave man, I am satisfied." Whilst Rome lamented the fate of her sovereign, the savage coldness of his son was extolled by the servile courtiers as the perfect firmness of a hero and a Stoic. The reign of Galenus, distracted as it was, produced only 19 pretenders to the throne. Cyriades, Macrinus, Ballista, Odenathus, and Zenobia. In the east, in Gaul, and the western provinces, Postumus, Lalianus, Victorinus, and his mother Victoria, Marius, and Tetricus in Illyricum and the confines of the Danube, Ingenuus, Regillianus, and Aureolus in Pontus, Saturninus in Isauria, Trebellianus, Piso in Thessaly, Valens in Achaia, Aemilianus in Egypt, and Celsus in Africa. To illustrate the obscure monuments of the life and death of each individual would prove a laborious task, alike barren of instruction and of amusement. We may content ourselves with investigating some general characters that most strongly mark the conditions of the times, and the manners of the men, their pretensions, their motives, their fate, and the destructive consequences of their usurpation. It is sufficiently known that the odious appellation of tyrant was often employed by the ancients to express the illegal seizure of supreme power, without any reference to the abuse of it. Several of the pretenders who raised the standard of rebellion against the Emperor Galenus were shining models of virtue, and almost all possessed a considerable share of vigor and ability. Their merit had recommended them to the favor of Valerian, and gradually promoted them to the most important commands of the empire. The generals who assumed the title of Augustus were either respected by their troops for their able conduct and severe discipline, or admired by valor and success in war, or beloved for frankness and generosity. The field of victory was often the scene of their election, and even the armorer Marius, the most contemptible of all the candidates for the purple, was distinguished, however, by intrepid courage, matchless strength, and blunt honesty. His mean and recent trade cast, indeed, an air of ridicule on his elevation, but his birth could not be more obscure than was that of the greater part of his rivals, who were born of peasants and enlisted in the army as private soldiers. Chapter 11. Reign of Claudius, Defeat of the Goths. Part 1. Under the deplorable reigns of Valerian and Gallienus, the empire was oppressed and almost destroyed by the soldiers, the tyrants, and the barbarians. It was saved by a series of great princes who derived their obscure origin from the martial provinces of Illyricum. Within a period of about 30 years, Claudius, Aurelian, Probus, and Diocletian, and his colleagues triumphed over the foreign and domestic enemies of the state, re-established with the military discipline the strength of the frontiers, and deserved the glorious title of restorers of the Roman world. Chapter 11, Reign of Claudius, Defeat of the Goths, Part 2. Aurelian had no sooner secured the person and provinces of Tetricus than he turned his arms against Zenobia, the celebrated queen of Palmyra and the East. Modern Europe has produced several illustrious women who have sustained with glory the weight of empire, nor is our own age destitute of such distinguished characters. But if we accept the doubtful achievements of Semiramis, Zenobia is perhaps the only female whose superior genius broke through the servile indolence imposed on her sex by the climate and manners of Asia. She claimed her descent from the Macedonian kings of Egypt, equaled in beauty her ancestor Cleopatra, and far surpassed that princess in chastity and valor. Zenobia was esteemed the most lovely as well as the most heroic of her sex. She was of a dark complexion, her teeth were of a pearly whiteness, and her large black eyes sparkled with uncommon fire, tempered by the most attractive sweetness. Her voice was strong and harmonious. Her manly understanding was strengthened and adorned by study. She was not ignorant of the Latin tongue, but possessed in equal perfection the Greek, the Syriac, and the Egyptian languages. She had drawn up for her own use an epitome of Oriental history, and familiarly compared the beauties of Homer and Plato under the tuition of the sublime Longinus. This accomplished woman gave her hand to Odenathus, who, from a private station, raised himself to the dominion of the East. She soon became the friend and companion of a hero. In the intervals of war, Odenathus passionately delighted in the exercise of hunting. He pursued with ardor the wild beasts of the desert, lions, panthers, and bears, and the ardor of Zenobia in that dangerous amusement was not inferior to his own. She had inured her constitution to fatigue, disdained the use of covered carriage, generally appeared on horseback in military habit, and sometimes marched several miles on foot at the head of the troops. The success of Odenathus was in great measure ascribed to her incomparable prudence and fortitude. Their splendid victories over the great king, whom they twice pursued as far as the gates of Ctesiphon laid the foundations of their united fame and power. The armies which they commanded and the provinces which they had saved acknowledged not any other sovereigns than their invincible chiefs. The Senate and people of Rome revered a stranger who had avenged their captive emperor, and even the insensible son of Valerian accepted Odenathus for his legitimate colleague. Chapter 11, Reign of Claudius, Defeat of the Goths, Part 3. By the death of Odenathus, that authority was at an end which the Senate had granted him only as a personal distinction. But his martial widow, disdaining both the Senate and Gallienus, obliged one of the Roman generals who was sent against her to retreat into Europe, with the loss of his army and his reputation. Instead of the little passions which so frequently perplex a female reign, the steady administration of Zenobia was guided by the most judicious maxims of policy. If it was expedient to pardon, she could calm her resentment. If it was necessary to punish, she could impose silence on the voice of pity. Her strict economy was accused of avarice, yet on every proper occasion she appeared magnificent and liberal. Zenobia would have ill deserved her reputation had she indolently permitted the Emperor of the West to approach within 100 miles of her capital. The fate of the East was decided in two great battles, so similar in almost every circumstance that we can scarcely distinguish them from each other, except by observing that the first was fought near Antioch, and the second near Emesa. In both, the Queen of Palmyra animated the armies by her presence and devolved the execution of her orders on Zabdus, who had already signalized his military talents by the conquest of Egypt. The numerous forces of Zenobia consisted for the most part of light archers and of heavy cavalry clothed in complete steel. The Moorish and Illyrian horse of Aurelian were unable to sustain the ponderous charge of their antagonists. They fled in real or affected disorder, engaged the Palmyrenians in a laborious pursuit, harassed them by a desultory combat, and at length discomfited this impenetrable but unwieldy body of cavalry. The light infantry, in the meantime, when they had exhausted their quivers, remaining without protection against a closer onset, exposed their naked sides to the swords of the legions. Aurelian had chosen these veteran troops, who were usually stationed on the upper Danube, and whose valor had been severely tried in the Alemannic War. After the defeat of Emesa, Zenobia found it impossible to collect a third army. As far as the frontier of Egypt, the nations subject to her empire had joined the standard of the conqueror, who detached Probus, the bravest of his generals, to possess himself of the Egyptian provinces. Palmyra was the last resource of the widow of Odenathus. She retired within the walls of her capital, made every preparation for a vigorous resistance, and declared with the intrepidity of a heroine that the last moment of her reign and of her life should be the same. The firmness of Zenobia was supported by the hope that in a very short time famine would compel the Roman army to repass the desert, and be the reasonable expectation that the kings of the East, and particularly the Persian monarch, would arm in the defense of their most natural ally. But fortune and perseverance of Aurelian overcame every obstacle. The death of Sapor, which happened about this time, distracted the councils of Persia, and the inconsiderable succors that attempted to relieve Palmyra were easily intercepted either by the arms or the liberality of the emperor. From every part of Syria a regular succession of convoys safely arrived in the camp, which was increased by the return of Probus with his victorious troops from the conquest of Egypt. When the Syrian queen was brought into the presence of Aurelian, he sternly asked her how she had presumed to rise in arm against the emperors of Rome. The answer of Zenobia was a prudent mixture of respect and firmness. Because I disdain to consider as Roman emperors an Aurelius or a Galenus, you alone I acknowledge as my conqueror and my sovereign. But as female fortitude is commonly artificial, so it is seldom steady or consistent. The courage of Zenobia deserted her in the hour of trial. She trembled at the angry clamors of the soldiers who called aloud for her immediate execution, forgot the generous despair of Cleopatra, which she had proposed as her model, and ignominiously purchased life by the sacrifice of her fame and her friends. It was to their counsels, which governed the weakness of her sex, that she imputed the guilt of her obstinate resistance. It was on their heads that she directed the vengeance of the cruel Aurelian. The fame of Longinus, who was included among the numerous and perhaps innocent victims of her fear, will survive that of the queen who betrayed, or the tyrant who condemned him. Genius and learning were incapable of moving a fierce, unlettered soldier, but they had served to elevate and harmonize the soul of Longinus. Without uttering a complaint, he calmly followed the executioner, pitying his unhappy mistress, and bestowing comfort on his afflicted friends. Returning from the conquest of the East, Aurelian had already crossed the straits which divided Europe from Asia, when he was provoked by the intelligence that the Palmyrenians had massacred the governor and garrison which he had left among them, and again erected the standard of revolt. Without a moment's deliberation, he once more turned his face towards Syria. Antioch was alarmed by his rapid approach, and the helpless city of Palmyra felt the irresistible weight of his resentment. We have a letter of Aurelian himself, in which he acknowledges that old men, women, children, and peasants had been involved in that dreadful execution, which should have been confined to armed rebellion. And although his principal concern seems to be directed at the re-establishment of a temple of the sun, he discovers some pity for the remnant of the Palmyrenians, to whom he grants the permission of rebuilding and inhabiting their city. But it is easier to destroy than to restore. The seat of commerce, of arts, and of Zenobia gradually sunk into an obscure town, a trifling fortress, and at length a miserable village. Aurelian might now congratulate the Senate, the people, and himself that in little more than 3 years he had restored universal peace and order to the Roman world. Chapter 28. Destruction of Paganism. Part 3. A nation of slaves is A nation of slaves is always prepared to applaud the clemency of their master, who, in the abuse of absolute power, does not proceed to the last extremes of injustice and oppression. Theodosius might undoubtedly have proposed to his pagan subjects the alternative of baptism or of death, and the eloquent Libanius has praised the moderation of a prince who never enacted by any positive law that all his subjects should immediately embrace and practice the religion of their sovereign. The profession of Christianity was not made an essential qualification for the enjoyment of civil rights of society, nor were any peculiar hardships imposed on the secretaries, who credulously received the fables of Ovid and obstinately rejected the miracles of the gospel. The palace, the schools, the army, and the senate were filled with declared and devout pagans. They obtained without distinction the civil and military honors of the empire. Theodosius distinguished his liberal regard for virtue and genius by the consular dignity which he bestowed on Symmachus, and by the personal friendship which he expressed to Libanius, and the two eloquent apologists of paganism were never required either to change or to dissemble their religious opinions. The pagans were indulged in the most licentious freedom of speech and writing. The historical and philosophic remains of Eunapius, Zosimus, and the fanatic teachers of the school of Plato betray the most furious animosity, and contain the sharpest invectives against the sentiments and conduct of the victorious adversaries. If these audacious libels were publicly known, we must applaud the good sense of the Christian princes who viewed with a smile of contempt the last struggles of superstition and despair. But the imperial laws which prohibited the sacrifices and ceremonies of paganism were rigidly executed, and every hour contributed to destroy the influence of a religion which was supported by custom rather than by argument. The devotion or the poet or the philosopher may be secretly nourished by prayer, meditation, and study, but the exercise of public worship appears to be the only solid foundation of the religious sentiments of the people, which derive their force from imitation and habit. The interruption of that public exercise may consummate, in the period of a few years, the important work of a national revolution. The memory of theological opinions cannot long be preserved without the artificial helps of priests, of temples, and of books. The ignorant vulgar, whose minds are still agitated by the blind hopes and terrors of superstition, will be soon persuaded by their superiors to direct their vows to the reigning deities of the age, and will insensibly imbibe an ardent zeal for the support and propagation of the new doctrine, which spiritual hunger at first compelled them to accept. The generation that arose in the world after the promulgation of the imperial laws was attracted within the pale of the Catholic Church, and so rapid yet so gentle was the fall of paganism that only 28 years after the death of Theodosius, the faint and minute vestiges were no longer visible to the eye of the legislator. The ruin of the pagan religion is described by the sophists as a dreadful and amazing prodigy, which covered the earth with darkness, and restored the ancient dominion of chaos and of night. They relate, in solemn and pathetic strains, that the temples were converted into sepulchres, and that the holy places which had been adorned by the statues of the gods were basely polluted by the relics of Christian martyrs, The monks are the authors of the new worship, which, in place of those deities who are conceived by the understanding, has substituted the meanest and most contemptible slaves, the heads, salted and pickled, of those infamous malefactors, who for the multitude of their crimes have suffered a just and ignominious death, their bodies still marked by the impression of the lash, and the scars of those tortures which were inflicted by the sentence of the magistrate. Such are the gods which the earth produces in our days. Such are the martyrs, the supreme arbiters of our prayers and petitions to the deity, whose tombs are now consecrated as the objects of the veneration of the people. Without approving the malice, it is natural enough to share the surprise of the sophist, the spectator of a revolution, which raised those obscure victims of the laws of Rome to the rank of celestial and invisible protectors of the Roman Empire. The grateful respect of the Christians for the martyrs of the faith was exalted by time and victory into religious adoration, and the most illustrious of the saints and prophets were deservedly associated to the honor of the martyrs. In the long period of 1200 years which elapsed between the reign of Constantine and the Reformation of Luther, the worship of saints and relics corrupted the pure and perfect simplicity of the Christian model, and some symptoms of degeneracy may be observed even in the first generations which adopted and cherished this pernicious innovation. The satisfactory experience that the relics of saints were more valuable than gold or precious stones stimulated the clergy to multiply the treasures of the church. Without much regard for truth or probability, they invented names for skeletons and actions for names. The fame of the apostles and of the holy men who had imitated their virtues was darkened by religious fiction. To the invincible band of genuine and primitive martyrs, the added myriads of imaginary heroes who had never existed except in the fancy or crafty or credulous legendaries, and there is reason to suspect that Tours might not be the only diocese in which the bones of a malefactor were adorned instead of those of a saint. A superstitious practice which tended to increase the temptations of fraud and credulity insensibly extinguished the light of history and of reason in the Christian world. But the progress of superstition would have been much less rapid and victorious if the faith of the people had not been assisted by the seasonable aid of visions and miracles to ascertain the authenticity and virtue of the most suspicious relics. In the reign of the younger Theodosius, Lucian, a presbyter of Jerusalem and the ecclesiastical minister of the village of Caphargamala, about 20 miles from the city, related a very singular dream, which, to remove his doubts, had been repeated on 3 successive Saturdays. The coffins of Gamaliel, of his son, and of his friend were found in regular order, but when the 4th coffin, which contained the remains of Stephen, was shown to the light, the earth trembled, and an odor, such as that of paradise, was smelt, which instantly cured the various diseases of 73 of the assistants. The companions of Stephen were left in their peaceful residence of Caphargamala, but the relics of the first martyr were transported in solemn procession to a church constructed in their honor on Mount Sion, and the minute particles of those relics, a drop of blood or the scrapings of a bone, were acknowledged in almost every province of the Roman world to possess a divine and miraculous virtue. The grave and learned Augustine, whose understanding scarcely admits the excuse of credulity, has attested the innumerable prodigies which were performed in Africa by the relics of St. Stephen, and his marvelous narrative is inserted in the elaborate work of the City of God, which the Bishop of Hippo designed as a solid and immortal proof of the truth of Christianity. Augustine solemnly declares that he has selected those miracles only which were publicly certified by the persons who were either the objects or the spectators of the power of the martyr. Many prodigies were omitted or forgotten, and Hippo had been less favorably treated than the other cities of the province. And yet the bishop enumerates above 70 miracles, of which 3 were resurrections from the dead, in the space of 2 years, and within the limits of his own diocese. If we enlarge our view to all the dioceses and all the saints of the Christian world, it will not be easy to calculate the fables and the errors which issued from this inexhaustible source. But we may surely be allowed to observe that a miracle in that age of superstition and credulity lost its name and its merit, since it could scarcely be considered as a deviation from the ordinary and established laws of nature. The innumerable miracles of which the tombs of the martyrs were the perpetual theater revealed to the pious believer the actual state and constitution of the invisible world, and his religious speculations appeared to be founded on the firm basis of fact and experience. Whatever might be the condition of vulgar souls in the long interval between the dissolution and the resurrection of their bodies, it was evident that the superior spirits of the saints and martyrs did not consume that portion of their existence in silent and inglorious sleep. The confidence of their petitioners was founded on the persuasion that the saints who reigned with Christ cast an eye of pity upon the earth, that they were warmly interested in the prosperity of the Catholic Church, and that the individuals who imitated the example of their faith and piety were the peculiar and favorite objects of their most tender regard. Sometimes, indeed, their friendship might be influenced by considerations of a less exalted kind. They viewed with partial affection the places which had been consecrated by their birth, their residence, their death, their burial, or the possession of their relics. The meaner passions of pride, avarice, and revenge may be deemed unworthy of a celestial breast. Yet the saints themselves condescended to testify their grateful approbation of the liberality of their votaries, and the sharpest bolts of punishment were hurled against those impious wretches who violated their magnificent shrines or disbelieved their supernatural power. The imagination, which had been raised by a painful effort to the contemplation and worship of the universal cause, eagerly embraced such inferior objects of adoration as were more proportioned to its gross conceptions and imperfect faculties. The sublime and simple theology of the primitive Christians was gradually corrupted, and the monarchy of heaven, already clouded by metaphysical subtleties, was degraded by the introduction of popular mythology, which tended to restore the reign of polytheism. Chapter 29. Division of the Roman Empire between sons of Theodosius. Part 1. The genius of Rome expired with Theodosius, the last of the successors of Augustus and Constantine, who appeared in the field at the head of their armies, and whose authority was universally acknowledged throughout the whole extent of the empire. Theodosius had tarnished the glory of his reign by the elevation of Rufinus, an odious favorite who, in an age of civil and religious faction, has deserved from every party the imputation of every crime. The strong impulse of ambition and avarice had urged Rufinus to abandon his native country, an obscure corner of Gaul, to advance his fortune in the capital of the East. The talent of bold and ready elocution qualified him to succeed in the lucrative profession of the law, and his success in that profession was a regular step to the most honorable and important employments of the state. He was raised by just degrees to the station of a master of the offices. In the exercise of his various functions, so essentially connected with the whole system of civil government, he acquired the confidence of a monarch, who soon discovered his diligence and capacity in business, and who long remained ignorant of the pride, the malice, and the covetousness of his disposition. These vices were concealed beneath the mask of profound dissimulation. His passions were subservient only to the passions of his master. Yet in the horrid massacre of Thessalonica, the cruel Rufinus inflamed the fury without imitating the repentance of Theodosius. The minister who viewed with proud indifference the rest of mankind never forgave the appearance of an injury, and his personal enemies had forfeited, in his opinion, the merit of all public services. Promotus, the master general of the infantry, had saved the empire from the invasion of the Ostrogoths, but he indignantly supported the preeminence of a rival whose character and profession he despised, and in the midst of public council, the impatient soldier was provoked to chastise with a blow the indecent pride of the favorite. This act of violence was represented to the emperor as an insult, which it was incumbent on his dignity to resent. The disgrace and exile of Promotus was signified by a peremptory order to repair, without delay, to a military station on the banks of the Danube, and the death of that general was imputed to the perfidious arts of Rufinus. The sacrifice of a hero gratified his revenge. The honors of the consulship elevated his vanity, but his power was still imperfect and precarious as long as the important posts of Prefect of the East and of Prefect of Constantinople were filled by Tatian and his son Proculus, whose united authority balanced for some time the ambition and favor of the master of the offices. The two prefects were accused of rapine and corruption in the administration of the laws and finances. For the trial of these illustrious offenders, the emperor constituted a special commission. Several judges were named to share the guilt and reproach of injustice, but the right of pronouncing sentence was reserved to the president alone, and that president was Rufinus himself. The father, stripped of the prefecture of the East, was thrown into a dungeon, but the son, conscious that few ministers can be found innocent where an enemy is their judge, had secretly escaped, and Rufinus must have been satisfied with the least obnoxious victim, if despotism had not condescended to employ the basest and most ungenerous artifice. The prosecution was conducted with an appearance of equity and moderation, which flattered Tatian with the hope of a favorable event. His confidence was fortified by the solemn assurances and perfidious oaths of the president, who presumed to interpose the sacred name of Theodosius himself, and the unhappy father was at last persuaded to recall, by a private length, the fugitive Proculus. He was instantly seized, examined, condemned, and beheaded in one of the suburbs of Constantinople, with a precipitation which disappointed the clemency of the emperor. Without respecting the misfortunes of a consular senate, the cruel judges of Tatian compelled him to behold the execution of his son. The fatal cord was fastened around his own neck, but in the moment when he expected, and perhaps desired, the relief of a speedy death, he was permitted to consume the miserable remnant of his old age in poverty and exile. The punishment of the two prefects might, perhaps, be accused by the exceptional parts of their own conduct. The enmity of Rufinus might be palliated by the jealous and unsociable nature of ambition, but he indulged a spirit of revenge equally repugnant to prudence and to justice, when he degraded their native country of Lycia from the rank of Roman provinces, stigmatized a guiltless people with a mark of ignominy, and declared that the countrymen of Tatian and Proculus should forever remain incapable of holding any employment of honor or advantage under the imperial government. The new prefect of the East was not diverted, however, by the most criminal pursuits from the performance of the religious duties, which in that age were considered as the most essential to salvation. In the suburb of Chalcedon, surnamed the Oak, he had built a magnificent villa, to which he devoutly added a stately church consecrated to the apostles St. Peter and St. Paul, and continually sanctified by the prayers and penance of a regular society of monks. A numerous and almost general synod of the bishops of the Eastern Empire was summoned to celebrate, at the same time, the dedication of the church and the baptism of the founder. This double ceremony was performed with extraordinary pomp, and when Rufinus was purified in the holy font from all the sins that he had hitherto committed, a venerable hermit of Egypt rashly proposed himself as the sponsor of a proud and ambitious statesman. The character of Theodosius imposed on his minister the task of hypocrisy, which disguised and sometimes restrained the abuse of power. And Rufinus was apprehensive of disturbing the indolent slumber of a prince still capable of exerting the abilities and the virtue which had raised him to the throne. But the absence, and soon afterwards the death, of the emperor confirmed the absolute authority of Rufinus over the person and dominions of Arcadius, a feeble youth whom the imperious prefect considered as his pupil rather than his sovereign. Regardless of the public opinion, he indulged his passions without remorse and without resistance, and his malignant and rapacious spirit rejected every passion that might have contributed to his own glory or the happiness of the people. His avarice, which seems to have prevailed in his corrupt mind over every other sentiment, attracted the wealth of the East by the various arts of partial and general extortion, oppressive taxes, scandalous bribery, immoderate fines, unjust confiscations, forced or fictitious testaments, by which the tyrant despoiled of their lawful inheritance the children of strangers or enemies, and the public sale of justice, as well as of favor, which he instituted in the palace of Constantinople. He aspired to place his fortune on a secure and independent basis, which should no longer depend on the caprice of the young emperor. Yet he neglected to conciliate. Yet he neglected to conciliate the hearts of the soldiers and people by the liberal distribution of those riches which he had acquired with so much toil and with so much guilt. The extreme parsimony of Rufinus left him only the reproach and envy of ill-gotten wealth. His dependents served him without attachment. The universal hatred of mankind was repressed only by the influence of servile fear. The fate of Lucian proclaimed to the east that the praefect, whose industry was much abated in the dispatch of ordinary business, was active and indefatigable in the pursuit of revenge. Lucian, the son of the praefect Florentius, the oppressor of Gaul and the enemy of Julian, had employed a considerable part of his inheritance, the fruit of rapine and corruption, to purchase the friendship of Rufinus, and the high office of Count of the East. But the new magistrate imprudently departed from the maxims of the court and of the times, disgraced his benefactor by the contrast of a virtuous and temperate administration, and presumed to refuse an act of injustice which might have tended to the profit of the emperor's uncle. Arcadius was easily persuaded to resent the supposed insult, and the praefect of the East resolved to execute in person the cruel vengeance which he meditated against this ungrateful delegate of his power. He performed with incessant speed the journey of 700 or 800 miles from Constantinople to Antioch, entered the capital of Syria at the dead of night, and spread universal consternation among a people ignorant of his design, but not ignorant of his character. The Count of the 15 provinces of the East was dragged, like the vilest malefactor, before the arbitrary tribunal of Rufinus. Notwithstanding the clearest evidence of his integrity, which was not impeached even by the voice of an accuser, Lucian was condemned, almost without a trial, to suffer a cruel and ignominious punishment. The ministers of the tyrant, by the orders and in the presence of their master, beat him on the neck with leather thongs, armed at the extremities with lead, and when he fainted under the violence of the pain, he was removed in a close litter to conceal his dying agonies from the eyes of the indignant city. No sooner had Rufinus perpetrated this inhuman act, the sole object of his expedition, than he returned, amidst the deep and silent curses of a trembling people, from Antioch to Constantinople, and his diligence was accelerated by the hope of accomplishing, without delay, the nuptials of his daughter with the emperor of the East. But Rufinus soon experienced that that a prudent minister should constantly secure his royal captive by the strong, though invisible chain of habit, and that the merit and much more easily the favor of the absent are obliterated in a short time from the mind of a weak and capricious sovereign. While the praefect satiated his revenge at Antioch, a secret conspiracy of the favorite eunuchs, directed by the great chamberlain Eutropius, undermined his power in the palace of Constantinople. They discovered that Arcadius was not inclined to love the daughter of Rufinus, who had been chosen, without his consent, for his bride, and they contrived to substitute in her place the fair Eudoxia, the daughter of Bauto, a general of the Franks in the service of Rome, and who was educated since the death of her father in the family of the sons of Prometus. Soon after the return of Rufinus, the approaching ceremony of the royal nuptials was announced to the people of Constantinople, who prepared to celebrate with false and hollow acclamations the fortune of his daughter. At the moment when he flattered himself that he should become the father of a line of kings, a foreign maid, who had been educated in the house of his implacable enemies, was introduced into the imperial bed, and Eudoxia soon displayed a superiority of sense and spirit to improve the ascendant which her beauty might acquire over the mind of a fond and youthful husband. The praefect still exercised an uncontrolled authority over the civil and military government of the East, and his treasures, if he could resolve to use them, might be employed to procure proper instruments for the execution of the blackest designs that pride and ambition and revenge could suggest to a desperate statesman. The character of Rufinus seemed to justify the accusations that he conspired against the person of his sovereign, to seat himself on the vacant throne, and that he had secretly invited the Huns and the Goths to invade the provinces of the empire, and to increase the public confusion. The subtle praefect, whose life had been spent in the intrigues of the palace, opposed, with equal arms, the artful measures of the eunuch Eutropius. But the timid soul of Rufinus was astonished by the hostile approach of a more formidable rival of the great Stilicho, the general, or rather the master, of the empire of the West. The celestial gift which Achilles obtained and Alexander envied, of a poet worthy to celebrate the actions of heroes, has been enjoyed by Stilicho, in a much higher degree than might have been expected from the declining state of genius and of art. The muse of Claudian, devoted to his service, was always prepared to stigmatize his adversaries, Rufinus or Eutropius, with eternal infamy, or to paint in the most splendid colors the victories and virtues of a powerful benefactor. In the review of a period indifferently supplied with authentic materials, we cannot refuse to illustrate the annals of Honorius from the invectives or the panegyrics of a contemporary writer. But as Claudian appears to have indulged the most ample privilege of a poet and a courtier, some criticisms will be requisite to translate the language of fiction or exaggeration into the truth of simplicity of historic prose. His silence concerning the family of Stilicho may be admitted as a proof that his patron was neither able nor desirous to boast of a long series of illustrious progenitors, and the slight mention of his father, an officer of barbarian cavalry in the service of Valens, seems to countenance the assertion that the general who so long commanded the armies of Rome was descended from the savage and perfidious race of the Vandals. If Stilicho had not possessed the external advantages of strength and stature, the most flattering bard, in the presence of so many thousand spectators, would have hesitated to affirm that he surpassed the measure of the demigods of antiquity, and that whenever he moved with lofty steps through the streets of the capital, the astonished crowd made room for the stranger, who displayed, in a private condition, the awful majesty of a hero. Theodosius had prompted by a pious motive of internal affection to adopt for his own the daughter of his brother Honorius. The beauty and accomplishments of Serena were universally admired by the obsequious court, and Stilicho obtained the preference over a crowd of rivals who ambitiously disputed the hand of the princess and the favor of her adopted father. The assurance that the husband of Serena would be faithful to the throne, which he was permitted to approach, engaged the emperor to exalt the fortunes and to employ the abilities of the sagacious and intrepid Stilicho. The guilty soul of Rufinus was alarmed by the approach of a warrior and a rival whose... You forgot something, Chris. Chapter 29, Division of Roman Empire between Sons of Theodosius, Part 2. The guilty soul of Rufinus was alarmed by the approach of a warrior and a rival whose enmity he deserved. He computed with increasing terror the narrow space of his life and greatness, and as the last hope of safety, he interposed the authority of the Emperor Arcadius. Stilicho, who appears to have directed his march along the sea coast of the Adriatic, was not far distant from the city of Thessalonica when he received the peremptory message to recall the troops of the east and to declare that his nearer approach would be considered by the Byzantine court as an act of hostility. The prompt and unexpected obedience of the general of the West convinced the vulgar of his loyalty and moderation, and as he had already engaged the affection of the eastern troops, he recommended to their zeal the execution of his bloody design, which might be accomplished in his absence with less danger, perhaps, and with less reproach. Stilicho left the command of the troops of the east to Gainas, the Goth, on whose fidelity he had firmly relied, with an assurance at least that the hardy barbarians would never be diverted from his purpose by any consideration of fear or remorse. The soldiers were easily persuaded to punish the enemy of Stilicho and of Rome, and such was the general hatred which Rufinus had excited, that the fatal secret communicated to thousands was faithfully preserved during the long march from Thessalonica to the gates of Constantinople. As soon as they had resolved his death, they condescended to flatter his pride. The ambitious prefect was seduced to believe that those powerful auxiliaries might be tempted to place the diadem on his head, and the treasures which he distributed with a tardy and reluctant hand were accepted by the indignant multitude as an insult rather than as a gift. At the distance of a mile from the capital in the field of Mars, before the palace of Hebdomon, the troops halted, and the emperor, as well as his minister, advanced, according to ancient custom, respectfully to salute the power which supported their throne. As Rufinus passed along the ranks and disguised with studied courtesy his innate haughtiness, the wings insensibly reeled from the right and left, and enclosed the devoted victim within the circle of their arms. Before he could reflect on the danger of his situation, Gainas gave the signal of death. A daring and forward soldier plunged his sword into the breast of the guilty prefect, and Rufinus fell, groaned, and expired at the feet of the affrighted emperor. If the agonies of a moment could expiate the crimes of a whole life, or if the outrages inflicted on a breathless corpse could be the object of pity, our humanity might perhaps be affected by the horrid circumstances which accompanied the murder of Rufinus. His mangled body was abandoned to the brutal fury of the populace of either sex, who hastened in crowds from every quarter of the city to trample on the remains of the haughty minister, at whose frown they had so lately trembled. His right hand was cut off and carried through the streets of Constantinople in cruel mockery to extort contributions for the avaricious tyrant, whose head was publicly exposed, borne aloft on the point of a long lance. According to the savage maxims of the Greek republics, his innocent family would have shared the punishment of his crimes. The wife and daughter of Rufinus were indebted for their safety to the influence of religion. Her sanctuary protected them from the raging madness of the people, and they were permitted to spend the remainder of their lives in the exercise of the Christian devotions, in the peaceful retirement of Jerusalem. The servile poet of Stilicho applauds with ferocious joy this horrid deed, which, in the execution, perhaps of justice, violated every law of nature and society, profaned the majesty of the prince, and renewed the dangerous examples of military license. The contemplation of the universal order and harmony had satisfied Claudian of the existence of the deity, but the prosperous impunity of vice appeared to contradict his moral attributes, and the fate of Rufinus was the only event which could dispel the religious doubts of the poet. Such an act might vindicate the honor of Providence, but it did not much contribute to the happiness of the people. Even Stilicho did not derive from the murder of his rival the fruit which he had proposed, and though he gratified his revenge, his ambition was disappointed. Under the name of a favorite, the weakness of Arcadius was required a master, but he naturally preferred the obsequious arts of the eunuch Etropius, who had obtained his domestic confidence, and the emperor contemplated with terror and aversion the stern genius of a foreign warrior. Chapter 51. Conquests by the Arabs. Part 1. The revolution of Arabia had not changed the character of the Arabs. The death of Muhammad was the signal of independence, and the hasty structure of his power and religion tottered to its foundations. A small and faithful band of his primitive disciples had listened to his eloquence and shared his distress, had fled with the apostle from the persecution of Mecca, or had received the fugitive in the walls of Medina. The increasing myriads who acknowledged Muhammad as their king and prophet had been compelled by his arms or allured by his prosperity. The polytheists were confounded by the simple idea of a solitary and invisible God. The pride of the Christians and Jews disdained the yoke of a mortal and contemporary legislator. The habits of faith and obedience were not sufficiently confirmed, and many of the new converts regretted the venerable antiquity of the law of Moses, or the rites and mysteries of the Catholic Church, or the idols, the sacrifices, the joyous festivals of their pagan ancestors. The jarring interests and hereditary feuds of the Arabian tribes had not yet coalesced in a system of union and subordination, and the barbarians were impatient of the mildest and most salutary laws that curbed their passions or violated their customs. From the rapid conquests of the Saracens, a presumption will naturally arise that the caliphs commanded in person the armies of the faithful, and sought the crown of martyrdom in the foremost ranks of the battle. The courage of Abu Bakr, Omar, and Othman had indeed been tried in the persecution and wars of the Prophet, and the personal assurance of paradise must have taught them to despise the pleasures and dangers of the present world. But they ascended the throne in a venerable or mature age, and esteemed the domestic cares of religion and justice the most important duties of a sovereign. Except the presence of Omar at the siege of Jerusalem, their longest expeditions were the frequent pilgrimage from Medina to Mecca, and they calmly received the tidings of victory as they prayed or preached before the sepulchre of the Prophet. The austere and frugal measure of their lives was the effect of virtue or habit, and the pride of their simplicity insulted the vain magnificence of the kings of the earth. When Abu Bakr assumed the office of caliph, he enjoined his daughter Aisha to take a strict account of his private patrimony, that it might be evident whether he were enriched or impoverished by the service of the state. He thought himself entitled to a stipend of 3 pieces of gold, with the sufficient maintenance of a single camel and a black slave, but on the Friday of each week he distributed the residue of his own and the public money, first to the most worthy, and then to the most indigent of the Muslims. The remains of his wealth, a coarse garment, and 5 pieces of gold, were delivered to his successor, who lamented with a modest sigh his own inability to equal such an admirable model. Yet the abstinence and humility of Omar were not inferior to the virtues of Abu Bakr. His food consisted of barley bread or dates. His drink was water. He preached in a gown that was torn or tattered in 12 places, and the Persian satrap, who paid his homage to the conqueror, found him asleep among the beggars on the steps of the Mosque of Medina. Under his reign, and that of his predecessor, the conquerors of the East were the trusty servants of God, and the people, the mass of the public treasure, was consecrated to the expenses of peace and war. A prudent mixture of justice and bounty maintained the discipline of the Saracens, and they united, by a rare felicity, the dispatch and execution of despotism with the equal and frugal maxims of the republican government. The heroic courage of Ali, the consummate prudence of Muawiyah excited the emulation of their subjects, and the talents which had been exercised in the school of civil discord were more usefully applied to propagate the faith and dominion of the Prophet. In the sloth and vanity of the palace of Damascus, the succeeding princes of the house of Umayyah were alike destitute of the qualifications of statesmen and of saints. Yet the spoils of unknown nations were continually laid at the foot of their throne, and the uniform ascent of the Arabian greatness must be ascribed to the spirit of the nation rather than the abilities of their chiefs. A large deduction must be allowed for the weakness of their enemies. The birth of Muhammad was fortunately placed in the most degenerate and disorderly period of the Persians, the Romans, and the barbarians of Europe. The empires of Trajan, or even of Constantine or Charlemagne, would have repelled the assault of the naked Saracens and the torrent of fanaticism might have been obscurely lost in the sands of Arabia. In the 10 years of the administration of Omar, the Saracens reduced to his obedience 36,000 cities or castles, destroyed 4,000 churches or temples of the unbelievers, and edified 1,400 mosques for the exercise of the religion of Muhammad. 100 years after his flight from Mecca, the arms and the reign of his successors extended from India to the Atlantic Ocean over the various and distant provinces, which may be comprised under the names of Persia, Syria, Egypt, Africa, and Spain. Under this general division, I shall proceed to unfold these memorable transactions, dispatching with brevity the remote and less interesting conquests of the East, and reserving a fuller narrative for those domestic countries which had been included within the pale of the Roman Empire. In the first year of the first caliph, his lieutenant Khalid, the sword of God, and the scourge of the infidels, advanced to the banks of the Euphrates and reduced the cities of Anbar and Hira. Westward of the ruins of Babylon, a tribe of sedentary Arabs had fixed themselves on the verge of the desert, and Hira was the seat of a race of kings who had embraced the Christian religion and reigned above 600 years under the shadow of the throne of Persia. The last of the Mondars was defeated and slain by Khalid. His son was sent a captive to Medina. His nobles bowed before the successor of the Prophet. The people was tempted by the example and success of their countrymen, and the Caliph accepted as the first fruits of foreign conquest an annual tribute of 70,000 pieces of gold. The conquerors and even their historians were astonished by the dawn of their future greatness. In the same year, says El-Nassim, Khalid fought many signal battles. An immense multitude of the infidels were slaughtered, and spoils infinite and innumerable were acquired by the victorious Muslims. But the invincible Khalid was soon transferred to the Syrian war. The invasion of the Persian frontier was conducted by less active or less prudent commanders. The Saracens were repulsed with the loss in the passage of the Euphrates, and though they chastised the insolent pursuit of the Magians, their remaining forces still hovered in the desert of Babylon. The morning of the succeeding day, 2011, determined the fate of Persia, and a seasonable whirlwind drove a cloud of dust against the faces of the unbelievers. The clangor of arms was re-echoed to the tent of Rustam, who, far unlike the ancient hero of his name, was gently reclining in a cool and tranquil shade amidst the baggage of his camp, and the train of mules that were laden with gold and silver. On the sound of danger he started from his couch, but his flight was overtaken by a valiant Arab, who caught him by the foot, struck off his head, hoisted it on a lance, and instantly returning to the field of battle, carried slaughter and dismay among the thickest ranks of the Persians. The Saracens confess a loss of 7,500 men, and the Battle of Qadessia is justly described by the epithets of obstinate and atrocious. The standard of the monarchy was overthrown and captured in the field. A leathern apron of a blacksmith, who in ancient times had arisen the deliverer of Persia, But this badge of heroic poverty was disguised and almost concealed by a profusion of precious gems. After this victory, the wealthy province of Iraq or Assyria submitted to the Caliph, and his conquests were firmly established by the speedy foundation of Bassora, a place which ever commands the trade and navigation of the Persians. Chapter 51, Conquests by the Arabs, Part 3. One of the 15 provinces of Syria, the cultivated lands to the eastward of the Jordan, had been decorated by Roman vanity with the name of Arabia, and the first arms of the Saracens were justified by the semblance of a national right. The country was enriched by the various benefits of trade. By the vigilance of the emperors it was covered with a line of forts, and the populous cities of Gerasa, Philadelphia, and Bosra were secure, at least from a surprise, by the solid structure of their walls. The conquest of Bosra, 4 days' journey from Damascus, encouraged the Arabs to besiege the ancient capital of Syria. At some distance from the walls they encamped among the groves and fountains of that delicious territory, and the usual option of the Mahometan faith, of tribute or of war, was proposed to the resolute citizens, who had been lately strengthened by a reinforcement of 5,000 Greeks. In the decline, as in the infancy, of the military art, a hostile defiance was frequently offered and accepted by the generals themselves. Many a lance was shivered in the plain of Damascus, and the personal prowess of Khalid was signalized in the first sally of the besieged. After an obstinate combat, he had overthrown and made prisoner one of the Christian leaders, a stout and worthy antagonist. He instantly mounted a fresh horse, the gift of the governor of Palmyra, and pushed forwards to the front of the battle. "Repose yourself for a moment," said his friend Durar, "and permit me to supply your place. You are fatigued with fighting with this dog." "Oh dear," replied the indefatigable Saracen, "we shall rest in the world to come. He that labors today shall rest tomorrow." With the same unabated ardor, Khalid answered, encountered, and vanquished a second champion, and the heads of his 2 captives who refused to abandon their religion were indignantly hurled into the midst of the city. The event of some general and partial actions reduced the Damascenians to a closer defense, but a messenger whom they dropped from the walls returned with the promise of speedy and powerful succor, and their tumultuous joy conveyed the intelligence to the camp of the Arabs. After some debate, it was resolved by the generals to raise, or rather to suspend, the siege of Damascus, till they had given battle to the forces of the Emperor Heraclius. An army of 70,000 veterans, or new levies, was assembled at Hems, or Emesa, under the command of his general Wirdan. On the plain of Aznadin, as Wirdan rode on a white mule decorated with gold chains, and surrounded with ensigns and standards, he was surprised by the near approach of a fierce and naked warrior, who had undertaken to view the state of the enemy. The adventurous valor of Durar was inspired and has perhaps been adorned by the enthusiasm of his age and country. The hatred of the Christians, the love of spoil, and the contempt of danger were the ruling passions of the audacious Saracen, and the prospect of instant death could never shake his religious confidence, or ruffle the calmness of his resolution, or even suspend the frank and martial pleasantry of his humor. In the most hopeless enterprises he was bold and prudent and fortunate. After innumerable hazards, after being thrice a prisoner in the hands of the infidels, he still survived to relate the achievements and to enjoy the rewards of the Syrian conquest. On this occasion his single lance maintained a flying fight against 30 Romans, who were detached by Weirden. And, after killing or unhorsing 17 of their number, Durar returned in safety to his applauding brethren. When his rashness was mildly censured by the general, he excused himself with the simplicity of a soldier. "Nay," said Durar, "I did not begin first, but they came out to take me, and I was afraid that God should see me turn my back, and indeed I fought in good earnest, and without doubt God assisted me against them, and I had not been apprehensive of disobeying. And had I not been apprehensive of disobeying your orders, I should not have come away as I did, and I perceive already that they will fall into our hands." In the presence of both armies, a venerable Greek advanced from the ranks with a liberal offer of peace, and the departure of the Saracens would have been purchased by a gift to each soldier of a turban, a robe, and a piece of gold, 10 robes and 100 pieces to their leader, 100 robes and 1,000 pieces to the caliph. A smile of indignation expressed the refusal of Khalid. "Ye Christian dogs, you know your option, the Koran, the tribute, or the sword. We are a people whose delight is in war rather than in peace, and we despise your pitiful alms, since we shall be speedily masters of your wealth, your families, and your persons." Notwithstanding this apparent disdain, he was deeply conscious of the public danger. Those who had been in Persia and had seen the armies of Khosroes confessed that they had never beheld a more formidable array. From the superiority of the enemy, the artful Saracen derived a fresh incentive of courage. "You see before you," said he, "the united force of the Romans. You cannot hope to escape, but you may conquer Syria in a single day. The event depends on your discipline and patience. Reserve yourselves till the evening." It was in the evening that the prophet was accustomed to vanquish. During 2 successive engagements, his temperate firmness sustained the darts of the enemy and the murmurs of his troops. At length, when the spirits and quivers of the adverse line were almost exhausted, Khalid gave the signal of onset and victory. The remains of the imperial army fled to Antioch, or Caesarea, or Damascus, and the death of 470 Muslims was compensated by the opinion that they had sent to hell above 50,000 of the infidels. The rest of the Arabian chiefs were fixed in their respective stations before the 7 gates of Damascus, and the siege was renewed with fresh vigor and confidence. The art, the labor, the military engines of the Greeks and Romans are seldom to be found in the simple though successful operations of the Saracens. It was sufficient for them to invest a city with arms rather than with trenches, to repel the allies of the besieged, to attempt a stratagem or an assault, or to expect the progress of famine and discontent. Damascus would have acquiesced in the trial of Aiznadin as a final and peremptory sentence between the emperor and the caliph. Her courage was rekindled by the example and authority of Thomas, a noble Greek, illustrious in a private condition by the alliance of Heraclius. The tumult and illumination of the night proclaimed the design of the morning sally, and the Christian hero, who affected to despise the enthusiasm of the Arabs, employed the resource of a similar superstition. At the principal gate, in sight of both armies, a lofty crucifix was erected. The bishop, with his clergy, accompanied the march, and laid the volume of the New Testament before the image of Jesus, and the contending parties were scandalized or edified by a prayer that the Son of God would defend his servants and vindicate his truth. The battle raged with incessant fury, and the dexterity of Thomas, an incomparable archer, was fatal to the boldest Saracens, till their death was revenged by a female heroine. The wife of Aban, who had followed him to the holy war, embraced her expiring husband. "Happy," said she, "happy art thou, my dear. Thou art gone to thy Lord, who first joined us together, and then parted us asunder. I will revenge thy death, and endeavor to the utmost of my power to come to the place where thou art, because I love thee. Henceforth shall no man ever touch me more, for I have dedicated myself to the service of God." Without a groan, without a tear, she washed the corpse of her husband, and buried him with the usual rites. Then, grasping the manly weapons which in her native land she was accustomed to wield, the intrepid widow of Aban sought the place where his murderer fought in the thickest of the battle. Her first arrow pierced the hand of his standard-bearer, her second wounded Thomas in the eye, and the fainting Christians no longer beheld their ensign or their leader. Yet the generous champion of Damascus refused to withdraw to his palace. His wound was dressed on the rampart, the fight was continued till the evening, and the Syrians rested on their arms. In the silence of the night, the signal was given by a stroke on the great bell. The gates were thrown open, and each gate discharged an impetuous column on the sleeping camp of the Saracens. Caled was the first in arms. At the head of 400 horse, he flew to the post of danger, and the tears trickled down his iron cheeks as he uttered a fervent ejaculation. "O God, who never sleepest, look upon thy servants, and do not deliver them into the hands of their enemies." The valor and victory of Thomas were arrested by the presence of the sword of God, with the knowledge of the peril. The Muslims recovered their ranks and charged the assailants in the flank and rear. After the loss of thousands, the Christian general retreated with a sigh of despair, and the pursuit of the Saracens was checked by the military engines of the rampart. After a siege of 70 days, the patience and perhaps the provisions of the Damascenes were exhausted, and the bravest of their chiefs submitted to the hard dictates of necessity. In the occurrence of peace and war, they had been taught to dread the fierceness of Khalid, and to revere the mild virtues of Abu Ubaidah. At the hour of midnight, 100 chosen deputies of the clergy and people were introduced to the tent of that venerable commander. He received and dismissed them with courtesy. They returned with a written agreement on the faith of a companion of Muhammad, that all hostilities should cease, that the voluntary immigrants might depart in safety, with as much as they could carry away of their effects, and that the tributary subjects of the Caliph should enjoy their lands and houses, with the use and possession of 7 churches. On these terms, the most respectable hostages and the gate nearest to his camp were delivered into his hands. His soldiers imitated the moderation of their chief, and he enjoyed the submissive gratitude of a people whom he had rescued from destruction. But the success of the treaty had relaxed their vigilance. their vigilance, and in the same moment of the opposite quarter of the city was betrayed and taken by assault. A party of 100 Arabs had opened the eastern gate to a more inexorable foe. No quarter, cried the rapacious and sanguinary Khalid. No quarter to the enemies of the Lord. His trumpets sounded, and a torrent of Christian blood was poured down the streets of Damascus. When he reached the church of St. Mary, he was astonished and provoked by the peaceful aspect of his companions. Their swords were in the scabbard, and they were surrounded by a multitude of priests and monks. Abu Obida saluted the general. God, said he, has delivered the city into my hands by way of surrender, and has saved the believers the trouble of fighting. And I am not, replied the indignant Khalid, and am I not the lieutenant of the commander of the faithful? Have I not taken the city by storm? The unbelievers shall perish by the sword. Fall on. The hungry and cruel Arabs would have obeyed the welcome command, and Damascus was lost, if the benevolence of Abu Obida had not been supported by a decent and dignified firmness. Throwing himself between the trembling citizens and the most eager of the barbarians, he adjured them, by the holy name of God, to respect his promise, to suspend their fury, and to wait the determination of their chiefs. The chiefs retired into the church of St. Mary, and after a vehement debate, Khalid submitted in some measure to the reason and authority of his colleague, who urged the sanctity of a covenant, the advantage as well as the honor which the Muslims would derive from the punctual performance of their word, and the obstinate resistance which they must encounter from the distrust and despair of the rest of the Syrian cities. It was agreed that the sword should be sheathed, and that the part of Damascus which had surrendered to Abu Obida should be immediately entitled to the benefit of his capitulation, and that the final decision should be referred to the justice and wisdom of the Caliph. A large majority of the people accepted the terms of toleration and tribute, and Damascus is still peopled by 20,000 Christians. But the valiant Thomas and the freeborn patriots who had fought under his banner embraced the alternative of poverty and exile. In the adjacent meadow, a numerous encampment was formed of priests and laymen, of soldiers and citizens, of women and children. They collected, with haste and terror, their most precious movables, and abandoned, with loud lamentations, or silent anguish, their native homes, and the pleasant banks of the Pharpar. The inflexible soul of Khalid was not touched by the spectacle of their distress. He disputed with the Damascenes the property of a magazine of corn, endeavored to exclude the garrison from the benefit of the treaty, consented with reluctance that each of the fugitives should arm himself with a sword or a lance or a bow, and sternly declared that after a respite of 3 days they might be pursued and treated as the enemies of the Muslims. At the head of 4,000 horse, in the disguise of Christian Arabs, Khalid undertook the pursuit. They halted only for the moments of prayer, and their guide had a perfect knowledge of the country. For a long way the footsteps of the Damascenes were plain and conspicuous. They vanished on a sudden, but the Saracens were comforted by the assurance that the caravan had turned aside into the mountains, and must speedily fall into their hands. In traversing the ridges of the Libanus, They endured intolerable hardships, and the sinking spirits of the veteran fanatics were supported and cheered by the unconquerable ardor of a lover. From a peasant of the country, they were informed that the emperor had sent orders to the colony of exiles to pursue without delay the road of the sea-coast, and of Constantinople, apprehensive, perhaps, that the soldiers and people of Antioch might be discouraged by the sight and the story of their sufferings. The Saracens were conducted through the territories of Gabala and Laodicea, at a cautious distance from the walls of the cities. The rain was incessant, the night was dark, a single mountain separated them from the Roman army, and Caled, ever anxious for the safety of his brethren, whispered an ominous dream in the ear of his companion. With the dawn of day the prospect again cleared, and they saw before them in a pleasant valley the tents of Damascus. After a short interval of repose and prayer, Caled divided his cavalry into 4 squadrons, committing the first to his faithful Derar, and reserving the last for himself. They successfully rushed on the promiscuous multitude, insufficiently provided with arms, and already vanquished by sorrow and fatigue. Except a captive who was pardoned and dismissed, the Arabs enjoyed the satisfaction of believing that not a Christian of either sex escaped the edge of their scimitars. The gold and silver of Damascus was scattered over the camp, and a royal wardrobe of 300 load of silk might clothe an army of naked barbarians. In the tumult of the battle, Jonas sought and found the object of his pursuit, but her resentment was inflamed by the last act of his perfidy. And as Eudocia struggled in his hateful embraces, she struck a dagger to her heart. Another female, the widow of Thomas, and the real or supposed daughter of Heraclius, was spared and released without a ransom. But the generosity of Caled was the effect of his contempt, and the haughty Saracen insulted, by a message of defiance, the throne of the Caesars. Caled had penetrated above 150 miles into the heart of the Roman province. He returned to Damascus with the same secrecy and speed on the ascension of Omar. The sword of God was removed from the command, but the caliph, who blamed the rashness, was compelled to applaud the vigor and conduct